just get this over with, shall we?
That's not the sentiment I want to be starting out a Star Wars review with, but we have a lot to get through, so let's cut to the chase this time. Sometime after the Battle of Crate, the First Order has begun their conquest of the galaxy. With the Resistance in hiding, they march unopposed through the free worlds, under the leadership of Kylo Ren. A message is broadcast from the hidden world of Exegol, revealing that Emperor Palpatine has returned. Kylo travels to Exegol to confirm the message and meets with a decaying clone of the Emperor, who prompts him to seek out Rey. Meanwhile, Rey and the Resistance have also confirmed Palpatine's resurrection and now seek their own way to Exegol. They determine they must find something called a Sith Wayfinder, only 2 of which were ever made. In the past, Luke Skywalker sought one of the Wayfinders but did not succeed. Accompanied by Poe, Finn, Chewie, BB-8, and 3PO, Rey seeks out to pick up Luke's trail. With only 16 hours to go before Palpatine launches his secret fleet codenamed the Final Order, it's all down to this mission. If they fail, all that has been fought for will have been for nothing. Star Wars is no stranger to bad movies. However, I find that each of them are bad in their own ways. The Phantom Menace sets up so little of the ongoing story that I find most of its events pointless to dramatize. Attack of the Clones is boring, due to most of the acting and writing being so forced and stilted that I'm hardly watching real people so much as objects saying lines. The Mandalorian in Grogu is so passively unengaging that I can't bring myself to feel much about it. But the Rise of Skywalker stands out for being the most frustrating to me. Part of that is because I am a fan of the previous 2 films and I care about these characters, so seeing them misused hurts my feelings. Part of it is because it's trying to be the end of a 9-film story arc that was never a truly solidified saga to begin with, so it was kinda doomed to fail anyways. However, I think a large portion of it has nothing to do with my relationship with the series. I think this film is poorly conceived as a finale. It's horribly rushed. It's a shoddy example of a story, it's compromised by its own production realities, and it's not like the film doesn't have good things in it, but those are almost in spite of itself. It's easy to forget about them after the chaos is over. This film is clearly made by talented people who have made other solid movies before, and dare I say, there are more moments and ideas here than in Menace or Clones that resonate with me. The problem is that it feels like the cast and crew are laying the tracks out in front of a speeding train. I don't care how skilled you are, that will only take you so far when you're not given the time you need for the job. To be perfectly blunt, I think The Rise of Skywalker is bad, perhaps the worst of the series, all things considered. However, it is far from the worst movie I've ever seen, and that might shock you given how much criticism I'm about to lob at the film. But it's true. I see a lot of folks that do go that far, label certain Star Wars films as the worst movie ever made. And I can't help but go, really? The worst movie ever made? Out of the hundreds that the average person is estimated to have seen? To be the worst movie ever made in my eyes, you have to have virtually no redeeming qualities, either story, acting, or production-wise. It goes beyond simply being disappointing. You have to have had no positive impact on the world of cinema at large or the careers of the folks that made it. If you encounter anyone who is a fan of it, it's more likely to be an ironic liking over something legitimate. In summary, you are a black spot to all associated with or who might view you. Truthfully, there's only a small handful of movies I've ever seen that qualify as being that bad. In case you're curious, here is a non-comprehensive list of just some of the movies I've seen that I think are worse than Episode 9. One common retort I hear from folks about Rise being worse is that it's made for a lot more money and is attached to a major franchise with good movies, so the failure is magnified. Well, given that my list included several expensive superhero films from popular franchises, a good number of them sequels, and other high-profile releases, not to mention other supposed expensive failures I haven't seen, like some of the Jurassic Park or Fast and Furious sequels that rival Rise's budget, I think this is a pretty flimsy justification. There are a lot of different flavors of bad movies, and I can understand why Rise is a major disappointment given people's investment in Star Wars. But I find the film is too competently produced, and I don't just mean because of its enormous budget. With moments of strong acting, some unexpectedly touching moments or callbacks, and several germs of great ideas, I can't place this towards the bottom. I'd rather watch Rise several times over before I rewatch films like Son of the Mask, Disaster Movie, or the animated Titanic efforts even once. That being said, none of this excuses Rise for its own sins. I'll start with the most immediate to me, the editing. Editing is an incredibly important part of the filmmaking process because it is what gives the piece its heart and structure. You take all the material you have, put it together, and find a rhythm for it. Rise is a mile a minute and so short with its edits that I can't get settled. There's not much time to breathe. A lot of the scenes cut away so quickly I can't process what I've seen or heard. We spend virtually no time explaining the things I feel should be explained, and character motivations and emotions are stated in an overly simplified and concise way so that it feels like there's no depth to the film. I feel like some of my edits for these reviews are better paced than sections of this movie, and I have to be quick with my cuts, so as to minimize the trouble I get into with the YouTube copyright bots for using film footage and original soundtracks. Rogue One gets a lot of flack for its fast-paced opening after the flashback, and while I agree with that, the opening of Rise makes Rogue One's feel like a Japanese tonal poem in comparison. In fact, during my most recent viewing, I actually shouted out to the movie, "Chill out!" The next most obvious issue is the script. If it wasn't clear by now, Rise makes it super obvious that this trilogy had no concrete plan in place during its conception. Based on subsequent interviews from the cast and crew and officially published materials, the most that was discussed were vague ideas and notions. Now, normally a lot of film trilogies are made up as they go along, without an overarching story in place, so I don't necessarily blame the filmmakers for not having something like that in place here. Having a plan in place may seem like the obvious thing to do to the layman when planning a trilogy, and it's certainly what I would do if I knew I was conjuring up 3 movies, but if you have enough talented people writing each subsequent chapter, they play fair with what came before, and are given enough time to do that job, you can make it work. This is what happened for the original trilogy. Lucas took lingering ideas from his early drafts of the first film and crafted the next chapter one at a time while sketching a vague idea of where the story could go afterwards. It's not the same as what I'd call having a plan, but it's at least something. One key difference is that he had 3 to 5 years depending on the film to do that. Even The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi had between 3 to 4 years each for their productions. After Colin Trevorrow's script was thrown out and he was fired round about June or July of 2017, the production was not given adequate time to compensate for his loss. J.J. Abrams was announced as the new director in September 2017. His co-writer Chris Terrio was hired only a couple of days before. The first art department meeting was on October 5th, with JJ having to make his pitch to Kathleen Kennedy and Bob Iger on December 15th, the day The Last Jedi opened in the US. Sure, the release date for Episode 9 was delayed from May to December of 2019, but when your director is also the writer, 2 years and 3 months are not enough time to put out your best work and make sure all your departments are covered. And while Abrams is talented in several areas, writing is not one of them. Granted, there have been great projects that had even less time that came to fruition, but most of the ones I can think of weren't heavily connected to past projects, at least story-wise, and the director wasn't usually the writer. Disney or Lucasfilm's insistence on having a Star Wars film released every year was an incredibly dangerous line in the sand to draw, and they suffered for it. It made money, and there are fans out there, but what they lost was the opportunity to make a trilogy that resonated with general audiences. Films that would continue to be popular not just because they were attached to Star Wars, but because they were legitimately solid films in their own right that worked alongside each other to tell a larger story. And coming after a widely ridiculed prequel trilogy that made Lucas step away from the public limelight of filmmaking, it's almost impressive the damage corporate deadlines and mandates can do to a once proud series. Case in point, some of the creative mandates for 9 included Leia must be in the film and Kylo Ren must be redeemed. Let's address Leia first. Carrie Fisher's passing in December 2016 was incredibly tragic, but not an insurmountable problem. Plenty of actors have passed before the completion of projects. The usual solution is to recast. I kind of expected them to do that here. Barring that, you could find a way to write the character out. This is less ideal when you have someone as important as Leia, but you can make it work. What they opted to do instead was one of the most asinine moves I think I've seen a major studio pull. Write a story that features Leia in a key role narratively, but limit her material to either unused scenes from the other films, or in some cases hire a vocal double and then Forrest Gump her into the film. What the dank ferric are you doing here, folks? Are you really going to limit the kind of story you can tell with Leia because you're refusing to recast her out of the foolhardy notion that sometimes a character and an actor are inseparable? At least, I sincerely hope it was something misguided like that and not out of a desire to push forward technology like a certain other director of the series was known to do. This is a perfect example of one of the key issues I have with Star Wars as a franchise. The original trilogy has achieved such a legendary status that its influence and our nostalgia with the films have worked their way back into the subsequent films and now determine the ongoing story. This is why you have so many callbacks, so-called aura farming moments, and repeated plot lines in the series. The original trilogy is so sacred and foundational that the rest of the series is not allowed to detach themselves from it. Carrie Fisher is so identified with Leia that the higher-ups decided it would be better to use footage of a dead actress to give a full performance versus letting another person give their interpretation of the character and letting Leia have a glorious final moment. Way back in 2014, there was a conversation between the members of the Intellectual Property Development Group, an internally formed Lucasfilm group tasked with determining where the series should go now that Episode 7's plot had been finalized. They settled on Leia being the Obi-Wan of the trilogy, the connecting piece between our hero and the villain, and that she should be the one that helps determine their destiny. That's a powerful idea that evokes great legends of old about matriarchal figures and their influence on their descendants. While the film technically does give Leia that influence, it's so horribly rushed. They didn't have footage of Leia that properly leads up to this rather contrived sacrifice she makes to help redeem Ben. It feels like a manufactured moment because it is. In my opinion, Lucasfilm took the wrong lesson from Solo: A Star Wars Story. Recasting Han was not the reason that movie didn't meet expectations. But because they decided that was one of the reasons, Leia is now forever shafted in the films, and that's a huge blunder. Having Kylo Ren redeemed isn't inherently a bad idea. Star Wars is, at its core, an optimistic franchise that is built upon second chances. However, the way it's presented is hollow. After Ben's conversation with a dead Han, Adam Driver gets no further lines beyond a very funny ow. We don't get to live with his choice, Rey doesn't get a chance to talk to him about this and grant him his redemption. He just slumps back and dies after using Force Heal in a way that's so comical to me that it undermines his loss. I've said it many times before in these reviews, I don't mind a repeat on principle. I mind it when it does nothing unique or different and doesn't add to the story. Even with the scene with Han, I don't think we have enough information or are given enough time to appreciate this turn. When Ben dies, it just happens. and it doesn't feel significant. In fact, it wasn't until after the third or fourth viewing of the film that it dawned on me that the last Skywalker blood was spilled. Sure, Rey is an adopted Skywalker by now, but the bloodline of Anakin is gone as far as we know. That should be a powerful moment, but it's just presented as a matter of fact. That's pretty bad. Adam still gives a fine performance, but there are moments where I think his character is being undermined. Him acting out instinctively, like choking the officer towards the beginning, or pointing his finger at Hux after his taunt and then doing nothing. They feel forced and come off as impish rather than intimidating. Kylo's lacking the true menace I think he should have at this point for being the supreme leader, and elsewhere I feel like he's sleepwalking. I'd still like to call out a few moments that work for me. Rey is supposed to be becoming unhinged to the point where it's scaring her friends, and this idea mostly falls flat. But Adam has a moment on the Death Star too. He takes a quick breath after Rey insists to give her the Wayfinder. Even he's taken aback by her sudden anger, and it's perhaps the only time I buy Rey being in danger of succumbing to the influence of the dark side. I also love his gesture to the Knights of Ren on Exegol when he gets the saber, as well as his no-look shot at an opponent when he's running to help Rey. Both feel so Han-like to me. Lastly, I understand why the scene with Han makes some roll their eyes, but personally, I really like it. There's more genuine nuance and subtext in that scene than in most of the rest of the movie. You really feel the father-son dynamic here, and Harrison brings a lot to the moment. I'm not even concerned with the mechanism of how this conversation could be happening. Films all the time have moments where a dead character has an interaction with someone living, and as long as nothing is being said that couldn't believably originate from within inside the living character's mind, I'm fine with the idea. Overall, this is definitely Adam's weakest performance of the character, but that doesn't mean it's entirely without merit. Let's jump over to Rey now. Coming off the last film, Rey is still yearning for some kind of acceptance. What she comes to realize is that acceptance happens after you've figured out who you are. The idea of the last two films, it doesn't matter where you come from, is continued here and given the added layer of you come from darkness. Rey's father is revealed to have been part of Palpatine's efforts to live forever, and along with her mother, they decide to hide Rey and make themselves invisible. Ultimately, they are discovered by Ochi of Bestoon and are killed, but thankfully Rey remains safe. After she discovers she's a Palpatine, she surmises her continued visions of darkness and the strength of the power within her make her destined for evil. Hence why she runs off to Ahch-To, the most unfindable place in the galaxy if you'll recall. Luke returns to give her the wake-up call she needs. Some things are stronger than blood. Not sure why she didn't think about that, given that Luke's ultimate alignment was with the forces of good when his father was evil, or how Anakin was turned back to the light, but whatever. Rey travels to Exegol, conquers the darkness within her by calling upon the strength of the Jedi, and defeats the embodiment of the Sith. At the end, she travels to Tatooine and gives her mentors a final burial. With the permission of Luke and Leia, Rey defines herself as the true legacy of the Skywalkers and adopts the family name. The conclusion of her arc comes down to a very logical place, even if I think the film is spinning its wheels a bit, getting her there. Whatever she decided she wanted to be, it needs to be an active choice on her part. In my mind, it didn't matter what name she chose or if she chose no name. Any of the choices, Skywalker, Solo, Palpatine, or just Rey, would have amounted to about the same thing. Her acceptance of who she wants to be and that her path is not written in stone. As a side note, I unironically love everything about the epilogue, and it's hands down my favorite scene in the film. It's one of the few places where a lack of dialogue is to its benefit. The music by John Williams might be my single favorite piece in the trilogy, and it closes out the saga with the perfect last shot. Our hero is looking off at the twin suns, just as Luke and Anakin did before her. Only she finds new purpose in their rising, not their setting. The new day is beginning, and the future before her is bright with possibilities. Now, let's get into the problems. Oh boy, did this movie create problems it didn't need to. There was no need to retread the evil heritage plot when her parents being nobodies was a powerful and fresh idea. My big issue with the switch-up is that it doesn't really change Rey's story in a meaningful way. All it really does is provide an explanation as to why she can have this incredible power, which comes off as a lame concession to the naysayers of the previous two films who demanded an explanation for her rapid power growth. When Luke learned of his dark heritage, it recontextualized his story and fundamentally changed his relationship to his father, which he prized above all others. He was no longer the son of a great hero who died nobly, he was the son of a man who he saw as his sworn enemy. When Rey learns about Palpatine, she was already progressing towards an acceptance of herself despite her lineage. Changing her parents from nobodies to the children of the Emperor adds nothing to that arc, and I'm not sure it incentivizes Rey to take out Palpatine any more than she probably would have in the first place. If anything, it serves as a momentary distraction and retards her growth. What happened to Rey's parents and the additional context of who they were, why Kylo insists he never lied to Rey about them being filthy junk traders, or why Ochi went to Pisana instead of Jakku is kept incredibly vague to the point of being distracting. It's not adding an interesting layer to the complexity of the story, it's complicating it to the point of disbelief. Suddenly, we find out that the previous two films were operating under a false assumption about who Rey was, and it serves to undermine that tale. This is a great illustration of one of the fundamental problems of this trilogy. Each film feels like it's competing with the others, not working in tandem. You can make arguments for how each of the films can technically still be working towards creating a whole story, but the argument will come off as a forced one given just what's in the films and how they play to an uninformed audience. Each film feels like a course correction from the previous, and it makes the ride to the end an incredibly awkward one. As much as I will continue to stand by this trilogy's merits, there's no denying it's an incredibly awful example of what a trilogy should be. And the damage Episode 9 did is still being felt within the stories we've been getting since. I want to tackle the Mary Sue problem one last time before I move on to Palpatine's return. To recap, I felt there were signs of Rey being a Mary Sue in the last two films, but ultimately there was nothing truly damning. Here, it really starts to cross over into that territory. Given that her actions indirectly led to the death of Luke, the loss of the Skywalker saber, and failed to prevent the loss of more Resistance fighters, Rey seems to have taken those losses in stride. Yeah, years happened in between, and several comics and novels address some of this emotional journey, but it's completely unfair to leave that crucial exploration out for supplemental material. Rey is the central hero of this trilogy. Why are we not spending more time with this fallout? Leaving that stuff out so we can get to action scenes and MacGuffin chases makes these characters feel less human, and it unfortunately makes Rey seem like a lifeless fantasy fulfillment. One of the key plot points of this film is that Rey is struggling to come to terms with her dark heritage. Sadly, the film breezes past any moment it could spend with her on this. The scenes with Finn are so short, and with Finn providing no pushback and just serving as a shoulder to cry on, these scenes are not depicting progress with her. They serve as check-in moments of her state of mind. Now, we do need those, but we also need actual conversations that progress her development, not one-sided exposition that tells us little. The only real moment we get is with Luke on Ahch-To, and even then, there's a lot of Luke telling Rey things rather than letting her interact with him. There are lines being said back and forth, but little actual dialogue. By the way, I'm not counting the scenes with Leia, as she doesn't actually interact with Rey. Daisy Ridley is unnaturally saying parts of the conversation that should be coming from Carrie, thus she holds the monopoly on these moments. There are also three expressions of her power that don't sit well with me. First, the Force lightning scene. Not the fact that she can do this, but that the result, Chewie's supposed death, is resolved 3 minutes later on screen, and Rey ultimately suffers no consequence for that act. For such a striking dark moment, it doesn't seem to matter to the movie. Second, the water skiff scene. I don't care how attuned to the Force Rey is supposed to be, I am not buying a desert scrap rat piloting the skiff against the gigantic waves. I'll defend her mind-tricking the stormtrooper, pulling the saber from the snow, beating an unbalanced Kylo Ren, defeating the Praetorian guards with unconventional moves, and holding a small ship in place, as there are very plausible explanations for each of these moments to me. This is the one where I throw my hands up, as it makes the difficulty of getting to the Death Star 2 just a feature, not an obstacle. All of the other moments I mentioned were supposed to be challenging for Rey to pull off. This is not, and it bugs me to no end. The third is the all the Jedi moment. It's not just the line or the fact that only now at the brink of death she is finally able to speak to the Jedi of old. It's something else. Palpatine is shooting quite the storm at her, and suddenly with 2 sabers, she's able to push him back and defeat him. This is such playground logic to me that I can't even begin to take the final demise of the ultimate evil of the galaxy seriously. By the way, Palpy, for the 3rd time in a row, you cannot seem to take the hint that maybe you should stop shooting lightning from your hands for your own good. Put all this together, I think the Mary Sue claim against Rey only really becomes a valid criticism by Film 3, and that's a shame. I still really love Rey as a character, and thankfully she's been in other projects that validate my feelings towards her. But man, she might be the one who falls the hardest of the characters in this story except for Finn, who I'll get to later. To sum up, I don't think Rey is inherently a Mary Sue. Rather, I think The Rise of Skywalker portrays her as such for its own purposes, and it's pretty close to unforgivable for me. Okay, now it's time to talk about the Palpatine return. Surprisingly, I don't have any problem with it in theory. And no, it's not because the idea has already been explored in the Legend storyline. Besides, Dark Empire is not a shining example of that lineup anyways. I think it's fully in Palpatine's character to have contingency after contingency. As established in Revenge of the Sith, all who gain power are afraid to lose it. One way Palpatine can avoid that is by cheating death, which is a notion that intrigues Anakin. Given Palpatine's penchant for secrecy, the fact that Anakin is a means to an end for him and not a trusted ally, and how Palpatine is a master schemer, I think it's entirely believable for him to look into ways of securing immortality. We already know he has cloning at his disposal, why wouldn't he look into cloning himself? I don't think Palpatine sees Darth Vader, or anyone else for that matter, as a legitimate successor to take over the Empire after his death. I think it's all about him, and he'll cheat death for however long as he can. The details of this program are frustratingly vague, highlighted by Beaumont's patronizing throwaway line during the briefing on Agent Kloss. But the germ of the idea is not a ridiculous notion to me. My problem with it is twofold. One, Kylo was clearly set up as the final big bad of this trilogy, another reason I don't like Kylo being redeemed. So bringing out someone else here either shows an enormous lack of confidence in your own character to carry out that role, or it's the same reason that Jaws came back in Moonraker after The Spy Who Loved Me. They don't want the kids idolizing a bad guy. The other reason I don't like Palpatine's return is the way it's presented within the trilogy. The previous 2 films were clearly not operating with the idea that there was a secret mastermind behind Snoke, and to announce his return to the galaxy off-screen feels like cheating. I think there's a way to introduce his return within just one film that doesn't come off as lame, and no, that would not be through a companion Fortnite effort. Beginning his return before the film even opens is such a whiplash move. This isn't some random glub shitto coming back. This is the big bad of the original 6 films. His return deserves more fanfare and dread. I do have some positives about Palpatine. I love Ian McDiarmid, and he's clearly having a ball being back. In addition, I'm a sucker for Sith planets, so finally getting one in the mainline saga was a real treat. Exegol is a wonderfully dark and foreboding place, with the odd lightning flashes and giant statues of the ancient Sith. It reeks of the dark side. I do have to wonder what's the story behind all those Sith cultists, but I suppose exploring what they are and what they're doing there is clearly too much for a 2.5-hour film, right? We've got pointless planets to introduce and a ridiculous MacGuffin chase to depict. We don't have time for cool universe building, do we? Let's talk about the other supporting players now. Poe gets the most to do in this film and is one of the only ones that doesn't come away looking worse afterwards. It's still very obvious to me that him surviving this long wasn't initially the plan, but this makes better use of him than Episode 8. Finn's handling is almost diabolically crap to me. His part got reduced from film to film, so his becoming a general for the Resistance is unearned, and he mostly just exists to support other characters. Him leading a band of former stormtroopers against the First Order is a fantastic idea, and I certainly don't mind the idea of him being Force-sensitive. At least, that's my read of his performance here. It's vague enough you could honestly just make a case for him being really into Rey. But I can't ignore the implications of what these films did to him and what it says. No, I'm not in the camp that feels that he got robbed being a Jedi, because I kinda saw through the marketing of TFA back in 2015. My theory was it was going to be a bait and switch and Rey would end up being the Jedi apprentice, so I never expected Finn to wield Force powers by the end. And there's no reason to believe as of right now that he couldn't be trained to be a Jedi later. In addition, I also don't think becoming a Jedi or not becoming a Jedi is any indication of your stature. However, this is where I put my skeptical hat on. Hollywood is a heavily politicized business, especially in dealing with a worldwide audience, and that factor tends to work its way back into films. This is why you have things like virtue signaling, whitewashing, and the like. Hollywood makes its moves based on what they think will sell best, not what's best for the story. I know, I'm sure that's a life-shattering revelation for everybody. The problem is when the temporary real-world situation of the time intrudes too much on the story. I have a hard time buying that Finn's diminishment in the trilogy wasn't a case of good old-fashioned casual racism being practiced by backwards-thinking people in order to appeal to certain markets, which is pretty indefensible. Again, Finn doesn't have to put on the robes like Mace Windu before him, but he is one of the three leads. You can't just discard him like that. Whatever angle you decided to go with, make his ending position count and be meaningful, not just a throwaway token end. On the topic of sideline main characters, do I even need to discuss Rose? Look, I'm not a fan of the character, but she was clearly introduced in 8 to have her play a big part in 9. Follow through with that, don't sideline her here. I recall J.J. Abrams once saying that the best thing Rian Johnson did for him was cast Kelly Marie Tran. That seems like a backhanded slap to the face after seeing this film, doesn't it? Neither of the two major new characters do anything for me. I'm generally against introducing new main characters in your finale that haven't already been set up before, but you could have made them count. Jenna is just there to give Finn an arc, and she really feels underdeveloped. Zori fares a little better, but she's yet another case of Star Wars casting a talented actor or actress and squandering them. I've been a fan of Kerry Russell for a while now, with Waitress being an overlooked gem to me. The summer before Episode 9 was released, she and Adam Driver happened to feature in a play on Broadway together called Burn This, and I was fortunate to have been able to see it. Both were excellent, with Adam getting a Tony nomination, and that certainly fueled my excitement to see her here. Alas, she's just another person reading lines to me. R2 and BB-8 both feel like background characters, which is ironic given their previous sizable roles. Dio feels shoehorned in and is just there for marketing purposes. Bringing back Maz makes sense for a finale, but there's no development of her unique personality like we saw in 7, so she's another background character to me. I keep forgetting Dominic Monaghan is even in this, and that should tell you what I think of Beaumont. I do like General Pryde a lot, mostly because Richard Grant can do no wrong for me, but he's ultimately another sinister Imperial officer. Hux's ending is abrupt if you cared about the character. Luke coming back as a Force ghost is something I was excited for, and while his scene is fine and is some needed downtime before the climax, I was expecting more of him. Lando's appearance is fun, but it does beg the question where he was before now. Babu Frick is a fun addition and is probably the best new character here. Chewie comes through relatively unscathed, although I don't know how you could really ruin Chewie. He does have a great character moment of pathos, where he falls to the ground and weeps after Leia's passing. I could have used more moments like that. I have to give the film props for finally giving 3PO something to do here. Starting with The Phantom Menace, I was always disappointed in his treatment, and he was just being thrown in because we expected him, not because he had anything to do. His part here is both an unexpected delight, particularly with the memory loss gag, and entirely appropriate for the saga's finale. Anthony Daniels has said this was one of his favorite films to work on, and I can believe that. This is actually a sizable plus in the movie's favor for me. Okay, have I covered this movie's insanely big cast yet? I suppose we also have to talk about the vocal cameos of the Jedi towards the end. I'm glad to hear so many from various projects, but I do go back and forth on the idea that's been suggested of actually seeing them. On the one hand, this movie is already pretty self-indulgent, so exercising restraint should be commended, particularly since I imagine getting all those actors in costume, some of which hadn't even appeared in live action yet, would have been pricey and a nightmare to figure out schedules. On the other hand, it might have been a great distraction from the silliness of Rey defeating Palpatine. And while this series has a problem with obligatory fan service, I can understand folks who are grasping at straws for an emotional fix like this, especially if they haven't liked much about this trilogy. It doesn't help that Avengers Endgame pulled off that kind of fan service in a meaningful way just a few months prior. The production aspects of this film are a little hit and miss. I've already talked about the editing, but the cinematography is also lacking. Not as bad, but still. I loved the looks of the previous two films, with The Last Jedi being a true visual delight. This looks so very standard through most of it, and I'm kind of bothered by the blue overtone of the film. The set design is serviceable, though nothing special. Of the new planets, I like Kijimi and Exegol the best. Returning to a healing Mustafar is a neat idea, though I would have also liked one final visit to Coruscant at some point. I'm not against returning to the ruins of the Death Star 2, it's a cool concept. The rusting interior, much like a sunken ship, makes for a great image, and I love seeing Rey climbing the remnants of the Imperial war machine again, much like she did when we first met her. I wish we spent more time here. If I complained about Jakku being yet another desert planet, you can bet I'm even more irritated with Pisana. Just stop it with the desert imagery. And it's even more unnecessary because we go back to Tatooine in the epilogue. The music is typical John Williams goodness. Of all the sequel scores, this is the one I most want an expanded release of, particularly because the Emperor's theme is one of my favorites and I adore its usage here. The main new theme is a pleasant one, and underrated to my mind. Williams still exercises his penchant not only for repeating themes, but tracking whole scoring selections from past films. I still retain my case-by-case approach to judging each. The music with Luke lifting his X-Wing is obvious, but probably the right call, and I appreciate them going to the trouble of re-recording it. I really loved the atmosphere that was added to the second Death Star ruins by using Vader's death music from Episode 6. Perhaps my favorite reuse is a tiny one on Kijimi when Zori and Poe are talking. The music is from Episode 2, when Anakin hears about Shmi's abduction by the Tusken Raiders, and it's a nice callback. One of the reasons I think Episode 9 is unsuitable as a grand finale is because it feels like the prequels are shafted too much in favor of the original trilogy. So getting anything as a nod to them is a step in the right direction. If you wanted to go further, John, you could have used the Duel of the Fates over Rey's and Kylo's final lightsaber duel on Kef Bir. Still, John closes his association with the mainline films out with just enough grace. He returned one more time to give Obi-Wan a theme for his TV show, but I think this should be his last Star Wars film. It just feels appropriate. Not to mention the blink and you miss it cameo on Kijimi. Some of the action here is surprisingly good. The speeder chase on Pisana is a great idea, and I think it's well staged. The final aerial battle of Exegol is mostly fine to me. Laugh at me if you want to, but the appearance of the civilian fleet really got me, with a rousing rendition of the main franchise theme. I also want to give a shout out to Rey and Kylo's lightsaber duel. As you may know, I'm personally not a huge fan of the overly choreographed and flashy fights of the prequels, and this seems like a good balance between that and the original trilogy fights. It's still filled with great uses of the Force. I smile at Rey and Kylo pushing each other's sabers back and having them leap in and out amongst these gigantic waves. I also love that Kylo actually wins the fight proper and only loses because he's distracted by Leia's reaching out to him. Even with this review becoming as long as it is, there are still plenty of things left I could talk about, but a lot of it ties back into the script. For context, the first shooting draft was delivered on July 25th, 2018, with shooting beginning August 1st. No wonder it feels like a hurried first draft of an effort. It pretty much was. Focusing the film on a MacGuffin chase could work, but there are a couple of blunders that kill the concept for me. Because we somehow didn't learn from The Last Jedi's mistakes, the film decides to bring back the ticking clock idea, except it's worse. 16 hours before the Emperor begins his assault on the free worlds. And the writers decided the characters have enough time to come up with a plan, travel to 3 planets, get back to Agent Kloss, and plan a last-minute assault that depends on a volunteer force that they have to raise up. It's not even that I can't buy them using hyperspace to travel to all of these locations within that time. I've said before that hyperspace has been unclearly defined going back to at least episode 2, if not earlier. But to have them spend the time that they do in each of these places and make the required travel, this strains credulity to the breaking point. The solution is simple. Don't make it 16 hours. Better yet, keep the time vague. Even better, don't have Palpatine publicly announce his impending return to the galaxy. If you want to travel to multiple planets, okay, but keep it concise if you're also going to have the ticking clock. 2 would have been enough. Combine Pasana and Kijimi into one, and have Poe suggest a droid mechanic on the planet they're on. I can buy that Poe with his Spice Runner past would have contacts in all the major ports. The Keth Beer visit also drives me nuts, at least towards the beginning. I'm not even going to touch on the Falcon's landing gear suddenly being broken. What a convenient coincidence. The thing I'm going to complain about is the thing everybody complains about. The stupid dagger. Standing right in the spot where you need to be to find the Wayfinder's location is bad enough. But I do not believe for a second that someone, probably Palpatine, would have created a dagger with the ancient language of the Sith and given it to a random Jedi hunter just so he can find Exegol once he captures Rey and bring her to him, and then not send someone out to retrieve the dagger when Ochi didn't return. This is beyond hubris, Palpy. This is sheer stupidity. By the way, I can understand that Palpatine doesn't let a good thing go to waste with the planet-destroying tech. But how in the name of Revan were you able to get that tech to be carried by individual Star Destroyers? I'll close the actual review out with one last observation. Yeah, some of the lines here are comically bad. The somehow Palpatine returns line will never not be funny to me, but honestly, it's not even the worst line in this film, and it does make sense within the universe. No, that honor goes to the I'm all the Jedi bit. Every time I watch that scene, I want to track down Abrams and Terrio and strangle them. Granted, neither are great writers. Terrio had the terrible luck to have won an Oscar for writing Argo, after which he goes and destroys that goodwill by writing the headache-inducing efforts of BVS and Justice League, which I still consider to be some of the worst superhero films of the 2010s. But come on, guys, I know you both can do better than this, even if you were paid in action figures over actual money. The Rise of Skywalker did make a profit, yes. It's far from a universally maligned failure, just looking at both critical reception and box office numbers. Yet I think its consequences were severe, and the damage it did was catastrophic. Beyond being a weak film in its own right, it sealed the fate of the sequels to be looked upon as a dismal failure of a trilogy. It retroactively made the previous 2 films look even worse to some. For some of the actors involved, I feel like they've struggled to maintain consistent careers afterwards. Lucasfilm shifted production to almost exclusively TV shows for the next 7 years, which had been very hit and miss for the general public. But perhaps the saddest thing for me as a fan of the previous 2 films, whether intentional or not, there have been very few excursions back to this point in the timeline beyond books and comics. The works we have gotten are appreciated, some of them quite good in my opinion, and there are signs that the sequels haven't been abandoned entirely. Many projects feature creatures, aliens, and planets from the sequels, and some, like The Bad Batch and The Mandalorian, feature important foundational setup for the trilogy. Who knows what the future holds? Currently, the next major theatrical effort is taking place post-Episode 9, and seems promising. And Lucasfilm insists that the new Jedi Order movie with Rey is still happening, though I'm not believing anything at this point until I start seeing production photos or trailers. Star Wars remains a lucrative franchise, but it has definitely lost some of the luster it once had in the late 70s, early 80s. While I don't think that's entirely just because of Disney's efforts, they have not helped to restore the franchise back to prominence like I think they intended when they bought Lucasfilm in 2012. I think it's safe to say that most people were looking forward to the sequel trilogy. Whatever historical revisionists try to tell you, the prequels were heavily criticized as they came out, with many placing the blame squarely on Lucas's shoulders. The sequel trilogy was a chance to let in new creative blood and flesh out the period after Episode 6. There was a wealth of stories you could tell, even if you decided to throw out the entire expanded universe, which honestly I was fine with doing. Instead, the films came out as what they were conceived as: corporate products meant to get the property back into the limelight. Oh, there's artistry in them to be sure, and I will personally stand by both 7 and 8 being more enjoyable experiences than the prequels, yet the sequel trilogy is a shining example of how quickly things can go wrong, and how out of touch major corporations can be about art. I don't think it's any better of a proper trilogy than the prequels, and in many cases it's worse, and it stands as a missed opportunity despite its successes. Perhaps the worst outcome of the sequels for me has been fueling the increasing division within the fan base. Instead of working to help bring together one of the most toxic fandoms and heal some old wounds, it instead unintentionally drove us further apart and brought out our nastiest human qualities. Exclusion and gatekeeping of fans, harassment of the creative talent, and a showcase of our ugliest prejudices and biases online, which continue to this day. If the noise was just about the relative quality of the films and TV shows and kept to that, that'd be one thing. But I think you'd have to be living in denial to claim that the backlash to the sequels wasn't magnified by constant examples of what I just mentioned and the almost tabloid coverage the internet seems to give these people. There's a reason the fandom is parodied in pop culture by their almost constant derision of projects, regardless of the quality, and is called the fandom menace. It's a shame, too, as I know plenty of folks who are reasonable, well-meaning people who can keep the disagreements to the films themselves. The fandom is not a monolith. We are a variety of people with a variety of different opinions. Unfortunately, we are sometimes personified by the scum of humanity who take film criticism too far to the point where it becomes a platform for them to expose their dark side, and that Star Wars fans evoke the image of a crybaby who cannot be satisfied with anything new. For my part, the failure of the 3 movies as a trilogy does not diminish my love for the series one bit. I have always known Star Wars to be a mixed bag of quality, and it's not hard for me to take the good with the bad. For every Knights of the Old Republic and Jedi Fallen Order, there's a Star Wars Demolition and The Force Unleashed too. Do I wish the property was overall better? Absolutely. I don't begrudge anyone who has become sick of this franchise and is left for greener pastures of creativity. Do I think Disney and Lucasfilm need to take a good hard look at themselves before embarking on more projects? Undoubtedly. And I think Disney in particular has been in flames during the last decade, to the point where I'm already groaning whenever they announce a new film. But am I gonna spend my days bemoaning Star Wars and constantly railing on the weaker aspects? No. There are only 3 or 4 truly bad movies for me, and even those have things I love. At the end of the day, I'm more positive about the sequel trilogy than not. I unironically adore many things about it. I think it has many laudable aspects, it engages me more than some of the other films with their take on classic storytelling ideas, and if nothing else, it reignited my love for the property at a time when the spark was almost out. And with that being the case, I'm always happy to revisit this trilogy, even if I do a facepalm about half the time. But hey, when has that not been the case with Star Wars?